Today, I am very pleased to introduce this exceptional sample course, How to Prevent Violence, Sociological, Psychological, and Spiritual Perspectives. It is being offered through the Preventing Violence Now Institute, which will soon be launching its public education program early next year. So two of my esteemed colleagues are joining us today. My colleagues, collaborators, and co-founders, Dr. James Gilligan and Dr. James Vrettos. They will be leading today's discussion. And for those of you who are new, I am Dr. Bandy Lee, forensic and social psychiatrist who is now trying to alert about the urgent need of a life-affirming world order. Now, the subject my colleagues will explore is arguably the most urgent and consequential in all of human history. We now face the greatest existential threat to humankind, which is not disease or natural disaster, but our own violence. With technologies of mass destruction advancing rapidly, while our understanding of the psychological and sociological sources of violence lags behind, we now risk becoming the first species on the planet to bring about its own extinction. There could be no undertaking more vital to our evolutionary task of survival than halting this suicidal trajectory. Doing so requires more than suppressing violent acts after they occur. It demands a profound understanding of the psychological, social, and moral forces that give rise to violence in the first place. Only by confronting these root causes can we begin to dismantle the recurring patterns that are driving humanity to annihilation. Such a transformation cannot be achieved by institutions or policies alone, essential as they are, but must arise from the imagination and moral courage of creative thinkers, ethical leaders, and ordinary people. By cultivating radical love and a broader vision for shared humanity, we can move beyond fear and domination toward forms of relationship and governance that unlock humanity's higher potential. So we are eager to hear from our eminent scholars of violence, Dr. James Gilligan, and then Dr. James Vrettos. Their illustrious careers are too long to enumerate here, and therefore I will refer you to my newsletter for a fuller introduction. But for now, briefly, Dr. James Gilligan has led some of the most influential prison and violence prevention transformations of our time. He first directed the court-mandated reform of the Massachusetts prison system following an epidemic of violence, establishing a Harvard University-led prison mental health service that succeeded in eliminating riots and hostage-taking and reducing homicides, suicides, and even post-release re-imprisonment to zero for extended lengths of time. He later played a central role in shaping Boston's multidisciplinary strategy that brought youth homicides down to zero for 2.5 years, an achievement dubbed the Boston Miracle, and emulated across the country. Dr. Gilligan then helped design San Francisco's groundbreaking, intensive jail-based Resolve to Stop the Violence Project, or RSVP, which achieved zero in-house violence and an 83% reduction in violent recidivism in the first year, ultimately becoming the nation's leading alternative to solitary confinement. His 2013 Board of Corrections Commission study found New York City's Rikers Island in severe violation, catalyzing major reform efforts, including calls for the facility's closure, borough-based jails, ending juvenile detention, and eliminating prolonged solitary confinement. His expertise has been sought at the highest levels of national and international governance. He served as chair of the committee for President Bill Clinton's highly successful national campaign against youth violence, as advisor for the House of Lords and to Prime Minister Tony Blair, and as consultant to the World Health Organization's new Department of Injuries and Violence Prevention. He also served as expert for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, as advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, in drafting a critical report on violence against children, as member of a committee on negotiations and conflict resolution of the World Economic Forum, and as consultant on prison and prison mental health systems in New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, and Denmark, and counselor to the President and Justice Minister of Poland on how to control violence in maximum security prisons. So I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Gilligan.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Let me begin by partially recapitulating what you just mentioned, which is the existential importance of the problem of violence, and particularly at this point in world history. We know that from the students of evolution that 99% of the species that have ever existed have become extinct. And there is no law of God or man that exempts the human species from that risk ratio. What I'd say is that the risk of our becoming the first species in all of evolutionary history to render ourselves extinct by means of our own violence toward ourselves, toward other members of our own species, which ultimately involves us, is greater than that risk is greater than it has ever been in evolutionary history, because we have invented thermonuclear weapons that are capable of destroying all life on Earth, and in any case, clearly all human life. So I can't, it would be impossible, I think, to overestimate or over stress the importance of understanding the causes and prevention of human violence, particularly at this unprecedented point in our history as a species. Now, as Dr. Lee mentioned, I've spent more than 50 years, actually, I go back to 1967, so it'll be 58 years, studying the causes and prevention of violence. I began by using prisons and jails, and eventually a whole city, the city of Boston, as you might say, social psychological laboratories in which to learn about the causes and prevention of violence as a problem in public health and preventive medicine, in the same way that microbiology laboratories do their research on trying to prevent and learn how to prevent and what causes other causes of death. Now, what I have found from that experience, I've then tried to apply to violence as it occurs outside prisons. In other words, I began my work in prisons of Massachusetts back in 1967, and more intensively in 1977, as a way of beginning to find out from the people who've committed violence what led them to do that. In other words, if you're trying to study an infectious disease, tuberculosis or syphilis or whatever, you have to look, you have to find the patients. That's where the problem is. Or with COVID-19 or AIDS or whatever in today's world. I went into the prisons for the same reason that Willie Sutton, the bank robber, said he went into banks because that's where the money was. I went into prisons because that's where the violence is. In other words, the most violent people in our society, in terms of behavioral violence, like homicide and suicide, are the people in our prisons. And my thought was that it was only by studying those people and learning from them that we could learn what causes violence on whatever scale throughout the world. And I will emphasize that has always been my goal from the beginning, to understand violence as an aspect of human nature that could threaten and does threaten all of us. Um, now, one of the first things I discovered when I began working with people in prisons was when I would ask somebody why he had uh, killed or assaulted or even raped another person, I would almost always get the same answer, that he would say, because he or she disrespected me. They said that so often that they abbreviated it into the slang word, instead of disrespected, dissed. He dissed me or she dissed me. And it struck me that whenever somebody uses a word so often that they abbreviate it, it says something about how central it is in their moral and emotional vocabulary. Um, what I came to realize as I studied these men, and I would love to tell you individual case histories and individual stories. I can tell you 1,000 of them because I've seen certainly more than 1,000 murderers over the last 50 years. Um, but I will spend a limited amount of time. And today I just want to give you an outline of what we can talk about and how we would expand it. Now, what I would say that what I learned from my observational work in the prisons, working with uh, individual murderers, serial murderers, mass murderers, and people who have committed all kinds of other crimes, including attempted murder. And I emphasize lethal violence there because that is the most important and ineradicable. I mean, you can't reverse a murder. People can sometimes recover from less serious forms of violence, at least to some degree. Probably never completely, but to some degree. But once somebody has committed or been a victim of murder or suicide, for that matter, you cannot do anything further. They're dead forever. So I've emphasized the study of lethal violence because I think that is what is most threatened, has always threatened us in throughout history, but now more than ever to an unprecedented degree. Now, what I found was the way to summarize it. And again, I'm going to give you kind of some, I mean, sound like abstractions, but believe me, they are based on intensive work with individuals. What I would say is that there are two emotions that are at the basis, or I'd say are the, I would call them emotive forces that are the motive forces, that is the causes or psychological causes of violent behavior. And those are shame and guilt. Now, what I would say about shame and guilt, as emotions, is that, and I would break it down and mention the shame as the opposite of pride. That is, there's a continuum from shame to pride, and guilt is the opposite of innocence. There is a continuum from the feeling of guilt to the feeling of innocence. Now, what I would want to mention is that those emotions are as central to all human behavior as love and hate are. And I emphasize love and hate because those are basically the causes of all human behavior. When we pursue something and want to expand our access to it, or keep it alive and present, we do that because we love that thing or that person. When we want to exterminate or destroy something, get it out of our lives, that's because we hate that thing or person. So love and hate are the master causes and emotions of all human behavior. How are shame and guilt related? Shame and guilt are love and hate, except as directed toward the self. Uh, and what they do is shame is the absence of or deficiency of self-love. Remember, the opposite of shame is pride. Pride is self-love, self-esteem, feelings of self-worth, and so forth. Shame is the deficiency of self-love. It is the response when people feel humiliated, insulted, disrespected, defeated, rejected, punished, treated as less worthy than other people. So there are many synonyms for shame and guilt. Uh, and it's important to recognize there's not just one word that people use to describe it. Now, what's important here in terms of understanding violence is that shame and guilt are the determinants of human violence. Uh, the primary motive cause of violence, and I'd say this is a necessary cause, but it's not alone sufficient. It needs also social and biological components as well. But the necessary psychological cause of all human violence ultimately is the feeling of shame, meaning the absence or deficiency of self-love, and the desire to replace shame with pride by humiliating other people in the way is the ultimate humiliation, which is to injure them or kill them, by which you show that you are more powerful than they are, you are not weak, you are not inadequate, you have so much power that you can wipe out their ability to shame you. Um, what shame motivates is anger toward other people and love toward the self. It motivates love toward the self, meaning like being egocentric, self-centered, selfish, grandiose, and so forth, or megalomania, belief that you're the greatest person on earth and so forth. Shame, when people feel ashamed, they are motivated to try to get as much love for themselves as they can and to put and to hate other people uh, uh, as the way of shaming other people and transferring their own shame onto the victims of their violence. Guilt is the opposite of shame. Guilt motivates love toward others and hatred toward the self. That is, when people feel guilty, they feel like they deserve punishment, they deserve pain, and they can reduce the feeling of pain, of guilt rather. And guilt is one of the, like shame, is these are among the two most painful emotions people can have. One way to reduce the amount of guilt people feel is by punishing themselves uh, and by being good to other people. My point is that neither shame nor guilt solve the problem of violence. Shame merely directs violence toward other people. Guilt merely directs it toward the self. What we need is what I would call a third emotion, which is beyond shame and guilt, and that is the emotion of love towards self and others. Uh, this is the emotion that is first of all, the natural component of human nature. I'm not talking about, people having to become saints to be able to love themselves and others. I'm saying that is an essential component of human nature. We are born with the capacity to love, the desire to love, and so forth. When a newborn baby is born, the baby is born with an inbuilt, innate drive to bond with the mother, to form an attachment with the mother, and that's what's called guilt. That's why Aristotle was correct 2,500 years ago when he said that human beings are social animals. Uh, Incidentally, the Greek language he used also meant we are political animals, but social and political are just two synonyms for the same ultimate reality. So what shame and guilt do is they not only motivate behavior, which is action, and they themselves are emotions, But there's a third function of human nature, in addition to emotion and action, and that is cognition. Uh, that is, shame and guilt motivate different cognitive structures, which in the realm of what Kant called practical reason, are called moral value systems. Moral value systems exist to tell us how we should act or how we should behave. Shame motivates what I call shame ethics. Guilt motivates what I call guilt ethics. In shame ethics, the highest good is pride, and the worst evil is shame and humiliation. Uh, Guilt ethics is the opposite. In guilt ethics, pride is not the highest good, it is the worst evil. In the guilt ethic of the Judeo-Christian tradition, pride became the deadliest of the seven deadly sins. In other words, pride is the most deadly thing. And humility, which to the shame-driven personality or moral value system is the worst evil, humility is the highest good. St. Augustine put it at the head of all of the virtues. So what I'm saying is shame and guilt are often used by people in ordinary language as if they were more or less synonyms of each other. What I'm saying is they are in fact opposites and antagonistic toward each other. Whatever increases shame decreases guilt. That's why being humble, being self-humiliated, having humility, it increases shame but decreases guilt. And whatever increases guilt decreases shame. That's one reason why shame motivates violence. The more guilty you are, the more virtuous you are in terms of a shame ethic. Now, I emphasize that because people often think of criminals who commit the kinds of violence that we call murder, uh, are people who never developed a moral value system, or they are amoral or immoral. I'm saying that is a huge mistake. What we need to understand is people who commit violence toward other people are motivated by a moral value system called shame ethics, which says you should kill other people. In other words, what I'm saying is there's not just one morality in the world. There are two moral value systems, and they are exact opposites of each other. And they've been with us throughout the time we've been thinking in terms of moral value systems. When I first started working in the prisons, I shared that ignorance. I thought the people in the prisons were those who were just had never developed morality. What I discovered to my surprise was I had never met people who were more constantly preoccupied with moral issues and morality and moral values than the people who'd committed the worst crimes and violence and homicides and rapes you can imagine. But what they felt was that what they were doing was required. Uh, it was innocent. They did not have any feelings of guilt about the harm they'd done to other people. Uh, what they would talk about is that they would focus on moral issues, talk about that more than almost any other subject. What they would be preoccupied with is issues of justice and injustice, but in which they saw themselves as the victims of injustice and their victims as the perpetrators of injustice toward them. Their victims sometimes just being scapegoats for other people who had humiliated them or shamed them. So what now Nietzsche, there are many philosophers who've talked about the two different forms of morality. I'll just quote one at the moment. That is Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, who distinguished between what he called master morality, which corresponds to what I'm calling shame ethics, and slave morality, which is what I'm calling guilt ethics. What he's saying is that master morality was the morality that told people they should become the masters of slaves. Slave morality is the morality that says you should accept being a slave and not trying to dominate other people. Be humble, forgive your enemies, love your enemies, resist not evil, and so forth. That's what a guilt ethic motivates. That's one reason why Freud commented quite correctly that nobody feels guiltier than the saints. They're people who are motivated to avoid guilt, or the theological term for guilt is sin, uh, and to wipe out their sin by means of self-punishment or letting other people punish them. What Freud did not notice or mention, because he never worked with violent patients, as far as am aware, is that no one feels more innocent than the criminals, the people who commit the violent crimes that we call them guilty for. But they don't have a capacity for feeling guilty. They are proud of the violence they've committed. They feel it was a way of rectifying the injustices that they feel themselves have suffered from. Okay, so that's a brief introduction. I'm sorry it's a very inadequate one to individual violence. I just want to quickly mention collective political violence, and then I will finish a lot of this talk. The difference between individual violence, like individual murders or homicides or suicides, is that they're aimed at one individual killing another or killing himself. Collective political violence differs in that from individual violence. In individual violence, people feel they have been shamed or humiliated by other individuals. And so they take out their anger on other individuals to try to undo their shame and humiliation by means of violence. When people commit collective violence, political violence, it's because they feel the group they belong to and which they identify with has been shamed and humiliated by another group. Um, uh, I'll give it just a few examples of our difference. And one way that one of the campaign promises that won Hitler to power in Nazi Germany was by pledging to undo the shame of Versailles, meaning the Versailles Peace Treaty, which he felt the terms of which had humiliated Germany and violated German national honor. And his solution for that was, of course, almost unlimited violence towards scapegoats, such as the Jews, the Romani people, and so forth, but to the largest scale toward the Jews. When let me just give one other example. When Osama bin Laden made his first public comments after the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York on 9/11, 2001, he explained why they'd done that. He said those attacks were payback for what he called 80 years of humiliation and contempt that he said the entire Western world, which the United States symbolized, had inflicted on the whole Islamic nation. So in case of both Hitler and Osama bin Laden, and I could give you a dozen other examples, people who've committed collective political violence or instigated it have been done to wipe out a collective shame, a feeling of collective dishonor. You can see the same thing in why Putin is attacking Ukraine today, or why Trump is attacking all kinds of people around the world. Well, we don't know yet what he'll do. So let's say that's a potential. But what I'm saying is when people are motivated by shame and are oriented towards self-aggrandizement, it doesn't necessarily just take an individual level. It can go on to a collective or political, national, or geopolitical scale. And I'd say throughout human history, shame is what has motivated wars and genocides, just as on an individual level, shame is the primary motive of homicide and suicide. Let me just add one last thing, and then I will stop. One difference between shame and guilt is shame primarily motivates homicide, that is, violence toward other people, whereas guilt primarily motivates suicide, which is violence toward the self. These are both forms of lethal violence. They kill the person involved. But the direction of the violence, the victim who's chosen, is the opposite in these. Shame directs violence outwards, guilt directs it inwards. Neither of them solves the problem of violence. That can only come about when people develop the capacity for love of self and others, a capacity for which the biblical term in Greek was agape. It's the Latin term is caritas, the root of our word charity. But it means the capacity to love others as oneself and as oneself. One thing I found among the violent prisoners I worked with as individuals was when they first came into the prison for the violent crime they'd committed, they felt totally innocent. They had no feelings of guilt for what they had done because they felt it was justified, morally justified in terms of the shame ethic that was their moral value system. After they had been in our program for a year or two and had been treated with respect, had been given opportunities for therapy and education, they began to realize how much pain they had caused other people. And they began to develop the capacity to feel guilty for what they had done to other people. At that point, they would become suicidal and sometimes make serious suicide attempts. And we'd have to struggle with that problem for the next couple of years. Finally, to my surprise, they did something I had not expected, but there it was. I observed it. They discovered that they could be of help to other people. If they were literate, they could help the illiterate learn how to read and write. And actually, about 40% of prison inmates are illiterate. Those who are literate could help others to read and write, or help them write letters home, or help them deal with the law library in the prison, or simply help by improving the quality of food in the kitchens and so forth. But they learned that by helping other people, they would feel neither shame nor guilt, because showing that they had the capacity to help others was something they could take pride in. It showed they had abilities, competencies, and more than they needed just for themselves. And they certainly would not feel guilty because they were helping other people, not harming them. So what I'm saying is these are universal possibilities in human nature. They're built in. They don't require people to become saints. What we need to do is find out what is inhibiting us, inhibiting anybody from, I'd say, from reaching what is a normal component of human nature that we are born with, and that is the capacity to love others and to love ourselves and to find alternatives to violence. So that when we're aggressive, it'll be toward whatever is killing us, bacteria, viruses, or whatever, but not other people or ourselves. Okay, let me stop there. That's a brief, inadequate introduction, but I just want to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about.
Wonderful, Dr. Gilligan. Beautifully said. Thank you for your wise words. Now we are greatly privileged to be hearing from Dr. James Vrettos, whose distinguished career began at Columbia University's School of Social Work in 1968. There he studied deviance, social movements, and social change under the renowned sociologist Richard Cloward, who remained his mentor and intellectual companion until 2001. Cloward's profound influence helped shape Dr. Vrettos' lifelong inquiry into deviance, violence, and justice, an inquiry richly expressed through his numerous contributions to Tikkun magazine, including incisive critiques of fear-based crime policies, analyses of stop and frisk policing, and visionary explorations of transformative justice. His scholarly work has also appeared in Law Enforcement News, Dialectical Anthropology, and Violent States and Creative States, Human Violence and Creative Humanity. Dr. Vrettos taught sociology, criminology, and criminal justice for more than 2 decades at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and for 10 years at Yeshiva University, where he developed their criminal justice curriculum and guided generations of students through internship programs. He is co-author of the widely respected text, The Elementary Forms of Statistical Reason, and served for over a decade as facilitator of New York City's Tikkun group of spiritual progressives. A committed activist as well as a scholar, Dr. Vrettos helped organize the first major civil disobedience action against New York City's stop and frisk practices in 2011 and played a critical role in the subsequent trial challenging those policies. His public engagement extends to influential media platforms, including the Rebbe, the Radical, and the Rev on Progressive Radio, and the long-running cable program, The Radical Imagination, on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Deeply involved in Reverend William Barber's new Poor People's Campaign, he has organized numerous conferences and public events dedicated to transformative justice, economic equity, and progressive social change. Dr. Vrettos.
Thank you so very, very much, Dr. Lee and Dr. Gilligan, and all of you who are here. It is really an honor and a blessing. And I just wanted to start us off by, you mentioned the show I used to host, the Rebbe, the Radical, and the Rev. Just in case some of you are curious, which you may or may not be, I was not the Rebbe and I was not the Rev. So actually, those roles were Michael Lerner was our rabbi, and Stephen Phelps, Riverside Church, was our reverend who did the show with us. So again, it's just wonderful to be here and to follow Dr. Gilligan, which I have to say, again, there's so many things that my work as a sociologist in criminal justice has overlapped what Dr. Gilligan has just told us and discussed. But again, as you obviously realize, my approach, sociological approach, starts quite differently in a sense. But ironically, the first major modern scientific work in sociology was by Emil Durkheim in 1898 and was entitled Suicide. And these social thinkers like Marx and Tocqueville and Weber and Durkheim, Saint-Simon, and others, these 19th and early 20th century thinkers, especially Durkheim, of course, were interested in establishing a field that was separate and distinct. And Durkheim's work really lays the foundation. It by far is the most influential work and paradigm that is developed that has dominated American sociology and criminal justice up until this present day. So I'd like to start with a brief overview of Durkheim's work, in which he, again, as I say, was very, his major emphasis was to establish the field. But I also want to emphasize that it was in response to various public health authorities, politicians who became very concerned about the rising rate of suicide in France at that time. So sociology from its very beginning, in a sense, had certainly scholarly, but also activist roots. Now, Durkheim looked at also the large-scale economic, cultural, social transformations that Europe was going through, the breakdown of the old order, the developments of democracy across the continent, the rise of industrialization, and above all else, the effects that capitalism was having on human beings, their psyche, their perception of themselves, and so on. He certainly understood that, but he did not carry it forward that much in his work on certainly on suicide. So he was more interested in establishing a discipline that was empirical, that was logical, that was rational, right? He looked at the data, the empirical data, and became curious about why these rates of suicide, and he called it the rates of suicide. So sociologists talk a lot about rates of, divorce or crime rates. We get that from Durkheim. So he was curious as to what caused rates of suicide to go up and down. And he felt if he could understand that, we could do something about it and come up with policies that would make a difference. And again, as I said, he took a topic that most people think of as pretty much exclusively an individual phenomenon, and yet showed that it was large-scale social forces external to the individual that were central in forming that individual. He called these forms, if you will, social facts. These are things external to the individual that impact on the individual. This is his wording, that restrain and constrain us. And the most prevalent suicide of his day, he understood to be anomic suicide. That was the term he used. There was altruistic suicide, in which the person gave himself up to the cause, for the movement, for the revolution, and so on. Then there was egoistic suicide, in which the person was, in a sense, under-socialized. There was a lack of socialization, a lack of social connection. But Durkheim was fixated on this idea of anomie, which briefly can be explained as a social situation that people were experiencing. They were once well established, right, in their lives, their lifestyles, their communities, and so on. Something comes along to disrupt that sense of unity, of belonging, that is a very painful experience for people to go through. So this also is a model. Remember, again, the social sciences were attempting to emulate the physical sciences, right? The physical sciences were concerned with finding the ultimate laws of the physical universe. Sociologists attempted to find or try to discover the social laws of the social universe. So there was a certain idea that, well, if we could find these laws, there was a certain determinacy about it. We just needed to find the law that was governing social behavior in the same way that the physical scientists, the physicists, and the biologists, and the chemists were uncovering the natural laws of the natural universe. Big problem there. Human behavior is very complex, and it's incredibly difficult to narrow it down to one overriding deterministic variable. Marx, of course, tried to do that with his economic perspective, economic determinism. There's an interesting book, 1916, by the Dutch criminologist Wilhelm Bonger, Criminality and Economic Conditions. And everything about criminality, criminal justice, and so on, was rooted in a capitalistic economic system that impinged on people, restrained people, structured them in various ways. But getting back to Durkheim, Anomie was, in fact, a very painful emotion and feeling to experience. He followed in the footsteps of the natural scientists by making it a hydraulic paradigm or model. That is, the more stress, the more anomie someone was experiencing, the more likelihood, probability of them committing suicide. So as one goes up, the other goes up. And that stress variable was all important, or weakened social control was all important in explaining the nature of deviance, criminality, and so on. Now, his recommendation was to make French life among the communities that were experiencing these rising rates of suicide to come up with policies that would make people more harmoniously connected to their communities again, education, jobs, and so on. Something very practical. Now, let me skip somewhat abruptly to 1939, where the concept of anomie gets picked up by probably the most famous American sociologist of the 20th century, Robert Merton, taught at Columbia. And his work was entitled Social Structure and Anomie. And he picked up on Durkheim's term, but he changed it. He said that the problem wasn't so much the disharmony that people were experiencing, the rootlessness, the normlessness, to use the sociological jargon, but the insatiability of the American political structure. And he had a means goals typology that he used, that the ends of American society, basically money, materialism, and it created this insatiability. It was never enough. I mean, I don't think we need to look around us and look at the would-be multi-billionaires who want to be would-be multi-trillionaires and da 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 da. So the insatiability that's built in the social structure, right? That's a given. Capitalism on steroids, whatever you want to call it, predatory capitalism, and so on. At the very same time, Merton argued, the means to distribute the goals was not equally distributed. Okay? And that was what explained for Merton the rise of crime and violence in certain groups of people whose ability to move up the ladder to try to achieve the material goods that so much pressure was placed on all of us created a certain sense of anomie that manifests itself in particular groups or communities that had been deprived or not really allowed for a variety of reasons to participate in that American dream. Okay, very, very important perspective, very influential. Skipping to Richard Cloward's work, Cloward did his work under Merton and added a very, very significant extension, in a sense, to that work in his own work entitled The Theory of Illegitimate Opportunities. Cloward argued this, that it wasn't one overall variable that explained. In fact, Merton was wrong in trying to explain all forms of social deviance by this one variable of anomie, right? He called it the innovative category. That was where most crime was committed. He also had a category named called ritualist. And then there was the retreatists, those who had opted out of the dominant culture. And then there was the rebel, the revolutionary, and so on. So Cloward argued that you can't explain all forms of deviance by this one variable, anomie. How does one explain why some groups turn to crime versus revolution, for example, or internalize it, become more suicidal or more prone to suicide? So Cloward opened up this whole idea of illegitimate opportunities, an overabundance of illegitimate opportunities, a lack of legitimate opportunities. He followed in with other workers and other scholars of his day, the Tilley's resource mobilization theory, and so on. And through sort of happenstance, his work, which he also, as Dr. Gilligan was pointing out, his work was also very much rooted in prison. So was Cloward's. Cloward also did work on his perspective in prisons as well. But 1960, of course, was beginnings of the Kennedy years. And Robert Kennedy became very interested in this idea of illegitimate opportunities. They were very concerned with juvenile delinquency, the connection between that, and so on. And so they funded a program called Mobilization for Youth. Cloward was the research director for that, started the Lower East Side, Manhattan. And again, so we're back to the sociologist as an activist. Durkheim wanted the sociologist to be a social expert, coming in there and applying these objective truths to reality out there. And Cloward followed in that tradition to a point. Soon after he became the research director, he decided that the program should have more of an emphasis not on preventing juvenile delinquency, gang violence as such, although that was part of it, but it became a concern with poverty. That was what was really behind the violence. And of course, we could talk about structural violence, the way in which a society, a culture creates the opportunities, and as Dr. Gilligan has pointed out, the need to divide and conquer us and to have scapegoats and so on and so on. So in a sense, Cloward began to politicize the term deviance, sociology of deviance, and tried to initiate a larger, more political discussion. And certainly the 60s was a time where that was occurring. Critical criminologists and labeling theorists like Howard Becker establishing the notion of master status, and Edwin Lemmert talking about primary, secondary deviation. Primary deviation being the initial rule-breaking activity versus secondary deviation, which is the consequences that people were experiencing as a result of the initial deviation, the primary deviation. So this opens up all kinds of possibilities. And along with, of course, the power of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, people became more and more interested in connecting, as again, the work of Dr. Gilligan and Dr. Lee, the moral with the political. Or as Cornel West puts it today, let suffering speak, as Dr. Gilligan pointed out. He listened to people who were suffering, their stories, their narratives. It wasn't a social expert coming in there with a preconceived notion that we knew best and we knew best for you. So the labeling theorists were very important. Cloward, during that decade, also entered in with his colleague and partner and later wife, Frances Fox Piven, and developed the welfare rights movement, welfare rights organization, which was a movement of welfare recipients, right, who would organize themselves and make demands on the system to break that system, in a sense, fiscally, so that those in power would be brought to bear and would have to, hopefully, the plan was to bring enough political pressure to the top that we would then have a guaranteed annual income. Of course, that did not work out, even though Nixon came up with a very, very modest proposal. But then you, of course, had counter movements to all of that and so on. But the struggle goes on. So I wanted to bring Cloward in as a figure, but one of the many figures in how sociology has evolved over the decades. And he's been certainly a very important one. There's many, many others. I just did a show on radical imagination with Tony Platt, who 50 years ago wrote a book called The Child Savers, in which he began to identify. This was back in 1969. And the irony was, when I was a grad student with Cloward, that was one of the books we read, the Child Savers. So these were mainly upper middle class professionals and women who thought they were doing good by coming up with various programs for orphaned and poor kids. And yet, in the name of doing good, another very famous book of its time by psychiatrist Willard Gilligan, in the name of doing good, more harm could and did occur. So that adds another problem to the whole role that sociologists and all of us need that we need to play, that we need to be aware of as we play out these roles. And let me finish off, because I know I'm sure there's a lot of hands going up, so there's a lot of questions. So let me just wrap it up by saying this. I've been very heartened. I know this is maybe a lot of people aren't, but I'm very heartened by the organizing that's going on in this country, the mobilization, especially with young people who are beginning to resist and stand up and come up with new ways of offering those alternative visions that Dr. Gilligan, Dr. Lee, and I have always advocated. Restorative justice, healing. How do we go about doing that? How do we go about bringing down? Well, one of the ways we begin to do that is to join up with people like Cornel West, Radical Love, right? Justice is what love looks like in public. Wow, think about that. Or Reverend Barber. So it's not about categories, it's not about labels. As he puts it, those words are too puny. Some things are just basically right, and some things are basically wrong. You don't come in and separate 4 or 5-year-old kids from their parents in brutal ways. We have come to that point of barbarity. So what we need, and let me close here, and this is what I think Dr. Gilligan was pointing out. Love, transformative love, an inclusive love can be the force that can overcome all of the greed, the immorality, if you will, the barbarity that is being perpetuated. And so that's what I think we need to begin to realize, that the social sciences can still be objective. Obviously, you don't make up data, but we need to take moral stands, and we need to ferret that out so people have a clear moral vision coupled with really social science that has integrity, that is speaking truth to power, and so on. All right, so I know there's so many questions, so let me stop there, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Well, thank
to
you
talk.
so much, Dr. Vrettos, for that illuminating talk and definitely very inspiring, as you can see from all the questions that have arisen. When I call your name, please unmute yourself before you speak. And if there's a specific speaker toward which you're addressing your question, please say so. Richard.
Hi. The first social science that modeled itself on Newtonian mechanics was economics. And we have the so-called free market based on an economy modeled as a solar system with in perpetual motion, and profit got a free pass as just merely inefficiency. And that has contributed to capitalism as a perversion of affect. In terms of, because it runs on consuming and playing into consumers' affects. But I wanted to talk about Dr. Gilligan's distinction between shame and guilt, because I think these represent two entirely different ways of looking at the universe. Shame refers to a series of ranks of things that are better, that are more ideal, better, and are higher ranked than other things. And the master and the slave, I think, are both part of that dynamic, because there's no master without a slave, and there's no slave without a master. And so, but the other way of knowing, based on guilt, has to do with mens rea, which recognizes the individual thought as a criminal motivation of greed or lust. And the guilt that works there is that it's because you've broken a contract. You haven't failed. It's not in shame. The question is, how good are you? Have you reached the ideal? But in guilt, it's, have you played fair or have you cheated? And I think, and Freud recognized this distinction as the ego ideal versus the superego. The ego ideal represents all of the happiness that you have if you're a baby at the breast. And the superego represents the father who says, don't get too close to your mother. She's married to someone else. So, and you may remember Carl Abraham's early definition of the superego as a corrupt prison guard that takes suffering as a bribe. So people make themselves suffer to kind of pay off their superego. But I think that these are what this distinction has to be made clear so that we distinguish between crimes that are based on narcissistic injury, which is social status, really, versus crimes that are based on individual jealousy, which is, I want what my father has, or I want what the rich people have, and I'm going to steal it. And those are two different, totally different dynamics. So, and I'm writing about that, and maybe I'll get a chance to communicate some more.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't know if people know that Dr. Goldwater is a renowned psychoanalyst at Harvard. Do either of you
Not
wish to
anymore.
respond?
I'm retired. Huh?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
If Dr. Gilligan or Dr. Vrettos have any thoughts, otherwise we'll move on to the next question. Okay, Jennifer.
Nope.
Oh, Jim, did you have something? Oh, Dr. Gilligan?
Gilligan, yeah.
Well, I could, I mean, I could add some things. I was glad that I think we're in agreement that shame and guilt are opposites. What I would add is that shame motivates, as I said, anger toward the self in response to feelings of narcissistic injury, which is another word for shame. That's the term that Freud and Heinz Kohut and other people, like other analysts, have used as synonyms for shame. And I would say the guilt develops later than shame. That is the capacity for guilt. Shame is a motive of defense against our most primitive need to depend on others and to need to have them love us. That means moving the direction of love toward the self. but people learn to become ashamed of their passivity and dependency. So shame can serve an adaptive and useful purpose, which is to motivate people to develop, to mature, to move from childhood to adulthood. The child to learn to tie his own shoelaces or walk rather than needing to be covered, carried. Shame motivates us to become literate rather than illiterate, learn how to read and write. The first violent inmate I worked with in the Massachusetts prisons, it turned out after I'd been seeing him for 6 months, he was illiterate. I didn't know that. He'd been concealing it from me and everybody else until the prison authorities gave him something he needed to read and give an answer to. And he had to admit uh, for the first time that he was illiterate because he was so ashamed of it. And then I thought, oh, that's good news because the prison had a school program so people who were illiterate could learn to read and write. So I referred him to that. But he didn't want to go there because to go there, he'd have to reveal to other people that he couldn't read or write. So his feelings of shame were stopping him from doing the thing that would overcome the feelings of shame. So that was the issue we had to work on for the next 6 months. Uh, Now, guilt comes around when people feel, in some ways, they have too much power. Uh, I talked with a prison guard once who had lost his temper and had been violent toward other inmates to a degree that his fellow guards thought he, might have stimulated or provoked a riot. So the commissioner of correction asked me to interview him and find out what was going on. And I will never forget one thing he said to me. He said, nobody should have as much power over other people as we do. Because he couldn't deal with the amount of power he had. I mean, he recognized what he had done was wrong. He felt guilty about it. Um, I just, I had the commissioner transfer him to part of the prison where he wouldn't have to deal face to face individually. You just press a button to open or close doors. Um, but I, I, I think it is really important to recognize when I talk about shame and guilt, I'm talking about love and hate, as I said. I mean, these are master emotions. And emotional forces are the motive forces of our behavior ultimately. Yes, we rationalize about it. We use cognitive mechanisms, but they really that both the cognitive mechanisms, meaning our moral value systems of what's good versus evil, and why we should be good rather than evil, and so on. That's the cognitive part of that shame and guilt motivate. But the two together motivate our action. So that's what I'm trying to get at. And I think, well, anyway, let me stop there because there are a lot of other questions. So please go on.
Thank you very much. Jennifer.
Thank you to all the doctors here. This is I'm just absorbing everything. It's very enlightening. I am coming at this from wearing two hats. So first of all, I have a nonprofit, and what we do is try to communicate to young people about how to develop protective factors so that they do not become violent. So I have a grant from the California Board of Community Corrections. I wear another hat in that I'm an attorney and I work in the juvenile dependency court. So what I'm going to talk about is really the seeds of what you're talking about. I see children and young people who are on the road to becoming violent. And what I see is a physiological event, let's say, that happens when they're very young, particularly when they have trauma. They are abused, neglected. They witnessed domestic violence at home. So now they have their nervous system is out of whack. We know that when their nervous system is out of whack, then their cognitive, they change cognitively. Their brain becomes more attuned to threat. And what I see happening is that all of these adaptations, I suppose, to try to avoid those feelings, those extreme discomfort of the fight or flight response, the fear response. And they look across town. I work with kids in public housing, and then of course, I work with the kids in the juvenile dependency system. Most of them live in poverty, and they see other children who have more. They go to the better schools, they have nicer clothes, they have, they get out of their nice car and they're rosy cheeked and everything seems to be great for them. So I think your analysis around the shame guilt is exactly spot on. And then that deeper thought around, who is causing that shame is not just society, it is almost like God himself, the universe itself has left me in this position. Why me, right? So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. The way that I'm addressing it, I actually just finished a book to help young people see that the thing they should be pursuing is to feel good. And what I mean by feeling good is how to manage their nervous system first, and then walk them through a path of you are heroic in your challenges in life, so that you can, and also recognize all the things that are not your fault. You can't control your physiology, you can't control where you're born, you can't control your adverse childhood experiences, you can't control the environment in which you were raised in. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on all of that. I know I just dumped a lot there, but. And any Dr. Gilligan, Dr. Vrettos, Dr. Lee.
Yeah.
Dr.
Okay.
Gilligan, would you like to answer first?
Yes, I was delighted to hear your description of what you're doing and what your thoughts are about it. One thing I would want to start with is I totally agree with you about that we also need to recognize that there is a biological component to human nature, and it's not just psychological or sociological. When I was in medical school, we were taught to think that every disease is biopsychosocial. That is, even tuberculosis, it requires a tubercle bacillus, but that alone is necessary for tuberculosis, but isn't sufficient. It also depends on your immune system and the mechanisms of defense it has, and also psychological things. Are you an alcoholic, or do you abuse drugs, which should increase your vulnerability to TB? Or are you poor and living in substandard housing and have less education and overcrowding and so on? So these social factors can. So in other words, you can't even understand tuberculosis without understanding that it's a biopsychosocial illness.
Yeah.
So that's true of all illnesses, ultimately. So we need to recognize that, and I couldn't agree with you more about. Well, recognize so much of what you said. Yes, poverty is central uh, uh, to most of the individual crime that we have, and of course, ultimately, it can be a motive on a collective scale for a whole country. But on an individual scale, 2,000 years ago or more, Plato said, "Poverty is the mother of crime." I mean, that's slightly paraphrasing him, but that's really exactly what he was saying. And it's not just social poverty, economic poverty, which produces most of the criminal violence in our country, but it's also other kinds of poverty that every kind of deprivation you can imagine. That leads people to become violent.
Yeah.
If I were trying to think, what is a master, approach to preventing violence, I would quote the Russian novelist Dostoevsky in his novel *The Brothers Karamazov*, where he said, "All are responsible for all. That is, all people are responsible for all other people. In other words, we are all responsible for each other. And until we accept that responsibility and realize that we all need to take care of each other, and we're all interdependent. I mean, I've also said to many of my patients, we all need all the help we can get. But that's true of everybody. That's true of human nature. We all need all the help we can get. Until we start helping each other more, we're going to continue to have out of control violence. And so I'll stop there. I can go on. But
Thank you. Dr. Vrettos, did you wish to add to that?
Just briefly, yeah, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Gilligan there and the excellent question and work that you're doing. This has got to be an interdisciplinary approach. And we've got to get out of our silos here. And I know restorative justice, I know Fania Davis, we've had on the show a couple times, out in Oakland, is doing such excellent work with young kids and their rage and anger and so on. And I think, again, this is where social movements can come in. Social movements are very powerful ways of people learning how to transform themselves and to come up with different narratives. And first, you have to let them speak. And their social ideas, the belief systems that they're under, and work with them at that level as well. Because as Dr. Gilligan just said, it's economic, it's political, it's social, it's spiritual. We are in an enormous crisis in this country at all kinds of levels. So we've got to respond in ways that bring people together in a unified way and understand the interconnections and not let the system divide and conquer us. So, that's what I would add to that
Excellent,
question.
Dr. Vrettos. Carmen.
Okay.
Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, sorry. I have a preface and two questions. The second question is not related to the preface. So the preface is, so I understand that there are many, many actions that one can take before resorting to violence, and that it is easier to take bold imaginative actions with courage before resorting to violence. But my question is, what about committing violence to end harm? That doesn't seem to fit into the categories of shame or guilt and seems to be motivated weirdly by love or really a sense of moral outrage. And I've noticed that this seems to apply to women in domestic violence situations who actually go on to injure or kill their abusers and the abuser of their children or children of abusers who injure or kill their abuser. Women who injure or kill their abusers get from what I've read, they get a lot of they're punished quite heavily, like more than you would imagine based on the situation. So how does that situation, how does your thoughts about guilt and shame being motivations of violence apply to that?
okay, I'd be happy to answer
Please.
If you'd like.
Yes. Yeah, I was directing it to Dr. Gilligan.
Yeah. First of all, I totally agree with you. There are many times where we need to, what I would say is engage in a small amount of violence in order to stop a larger amount of violence. But that means violence to help others. If a mass murderer is killing people in a grocery store or a parking lot, and you can't stop him, he won't listen to words. A policeman or somebody else will need to shoot the person, shoot him dead. That's a homicide. But it's really violence to try to help other people. Sometimes wars, I think, do need to be fought in order to protect people from the violence of others. I'm not a pacifist. In fact, I think one of the limitations of guilt ethics, and the reason I think we need to transcend it by developing the capacity for love of ourselves and others, is that guilt ethics often motivates pacifism, which can interfere with our capacity to help others when they are being victimized by somebody else. In other words, guilt can inhibit us from being aggressive enough to actually defend and protect those who need our help. And that may mean they may need our violence when that's necessary. But my sense is when we have to resort to violence, and violence of our own is the only way to stop somebody from being violent toward others, we also, once we've done that, we need to then stop and ask ourselves, what have we done or what have we not done that enable this violence to come about in the first place? In other words, how can we achieve primary prevention of violence, which is a category like in public health, primary prevention of a physical illness, you know, um, uh, can mean cleaning up the water supply and the sewer system, you know, which has nothing to do with doctors or medicines or hospitals. I'm saying the primary prevention of violence can mean cleaning up our social system, our economic system, and so forth. And that has nothing to do with police or prisons or punishments or the criminal justice system. So I would agree with you that violence sometimes is necessary in order to stop violence, and that being excessively guilt-ridden can prevent people or inhibit them from being as aggressive as they need to be to stop the violence. I hope that is relevant to your question.
Yeah, it is. I'm thinking about Merrick Garland actually when you say that. So how is Putin motivated by shame to wipe out Ukraine?
He said that himself. He said the Western world may not recognize this, but he said what he was talking about was that Russia had been shamed by the rest of the world when the Soviet Union imploded, and instead of being an empire, they lost their empire. I mean, think of all the countries around
Yeah.
surrounding Russia that used to be part of their empire. Putin is trying to go back to the Russian Empire, to Peter the Great and Ivan the Great and so forth, as well as Stalin. Uh, I mean, he was one of Stalin's lackeys. He worked well later than Stalin, but he was part of that, trying to protect their empire. When that empire, well, he's a good example of what I was talking about in my first talk about feeling shame as a group that's shamed, as a member of a group that's been shamed by another group. He feels the Western world, NATO, defeated and therefore humiliated Russia. And what he wants to get Ukraine for is to build up Russian self-esteem again and pride in Russia and overcome the collective humiliation that they suffered when they lost the Cold War. Again, I hope that speaks to what
that makes sense. That Ukraine is part of all of those Baltic states that used to be a part of Russia. I get it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mitch.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Gilligan. What a pleasure it is I can't even believe I'm talking to you. And Dr. Vrettos. Dr. Vrettos, thank you for the great interview with Bandy and Dr. Gilligan. And let's see, Dr. Gilligan, I read your wife's book in a different voice. When was that? 1982, 3? It was in nursing school at UCLA. And so going to UCLA did not prepare me for what I had to deal with, kind of like you in your residency program in prison psychiatry. So I ended up at LA County USC Medical Center in the psychiatric hospital. I worked in the emergency room in pediatric and adolescent adult. So I saw extreme violence. Let me go to what I'm reminded by. So I almost killed someone, or potentially, because this person was trying to kill the former LA County DMH medical director, Raj Shaner. At 12 midnight, he was choking him to death. I ran in the room and I ripped his hair back, and the guy punched me, and I grabbed a chair and, I bashed him. And Dr. Shaner was on the ground, with a purple face. And so, I had to take weeks off because, is this within my moral thing to do? But I couldn't do anything. What could I do? So I just want to let you know that happened. So the 3, 4, 5-year-olds I dealt with, when I walked on the first unit and I talked to the kid, I won't tell you what he said to me, but it was horrific. And so I saw these adolescents and children who, I wasn't ready for that. Nursing school did not teach me for what I was about to see. One thing I found though, so I worked primarily adolescent. It was very violent. One thing I found, I'm not boasting, but it's really weird. I was kind of like sensitive, like what's going on. And I found like I ended up not putting people in restraints when they tried to kill me or someone. I just talked to them, and it's like you, when they felt seen, heard, and respected, I got a pretty good result. Whereas if others go, you're going in restraints, blah, 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 and the kids would, go off. So I ended up in community mental health for 16 years. And we got people out of prison, out of Twin Towers jail, and some were violent and they had to be discharged. Some were in gangs. And when they had case management, social work, psychiatry, etc., and when they had respect, these people out of prison, I told Bandy, yeah, they ended up getting housing, getting a job, and sort of reinventing who they were over time. And that was with a lot of respect. So I'm going to wrap it up here. So I told Bandy, I had one guy who was pacing in our dining room and someone stole something. And our team was eating some holiday thing, eating in the back. And I said to my boss, the guy's pacing, and like no one did anything. And he was pacing more and more. I'm like, you know what? The hell with this. I walked out and talked to him. Ultimately, he didn't hit me, put his hand up to my face to slap my face. And I go, I trust you. He started crying and hugged me. And he goes, who grew you up? I don't know where I got this, but he felt respected and he didn't do anything. And it was risky for me, but I intuitively just did that. And so, I look at our society today, and structural violence you talk about, and the transfer of wealth from the poor now to the richest of the rich. And I said to Bandy, your ideas are wonderful, Dr. Gilligan, your ideas are wonderful. Like, what would it take though to break these power structures? Because last thing, if you look at prisons, to me, and you look at people on death row, I see it as those are the throwaways in society. But how did they get there? Adverse childhood experiences, and like Gabor-Mate said, the myth of normal, a sick culture. So in a way, they're the scapegoats for the sick culture, and we blame them and don't look at the culture. And people say we need to punish them. Well, what about the culture? Anyway, that's all. I just want to say that I really appreciate it.
Look, I agree with everything you said. I think what you just said is brilliant. I'm glad you said it. I didn't have to. You put it correctly, and you raised all of the themes that I think are relevant here. And the first thing I was responding to, and what you're saying is that you, like anybody who works with violent people, experience your own vicarious trauma. That is, when you have to deal with the amount of violence that other people commit, that comes at expense to you, especially when they've been violent in your presence and you've got to fight with them. Believe me, I know what you mean. I was responsible for working with a large staff in prisons where that was a daily problem, somebody going, berserk. And we had to support each other and provide, in a way, therapy to each other for the post-traumatic stress disorder that we were all, being vulnerable to. I also thought, I loved what you were saying. Another part of what you said, what I would summarize it by saying this, that the only alternative to violence is words. That is, once you've got if you're preventing violence before sometimes when it's actually starting, yes, you have to use violence yourself. I may have to hit this guy with a chair, but that's to stop him from committing murder. But once it's just somebody who's pacing and isn't yet violent, you need words. I remember when I had a similar experience when I was leading a therapy group in my first year, the first time I'd ever been inside a prison and worked with violent people. And in the group, there was one huge big guy and a much smaller guy, and they got into a dispute with each other. They each felt they'd been insulted by the other. And I was scared to death that the big guy was going to kill the little guy, because one blow of his fist and the little guy would be dead. And there weren't any correction officers there, so I had to deal with it myself. And so I just started saying, gee, that made you mad, didn't it? And wow, boy, I'd feel mad if somebody said that to me. Oh boy, how mad do you feel? Can you tell us? And finally, the whole thing became so ludicrous that even they started laughing, and the whole group. And what struck me was once we could put things into words, we didn't use violence. But that's true on a political scale. We use negotiations and diplomacy as an alternative to warfare. And the same thing applies on an individual scale. That's why psychotherapy, education, all these things that use words are the alternative to violence and the way we can make progress. Finally, I just say, I have the same question you do. How can we convince people in our society to do this? The book, I've written many books, but the book I'm writing now, I'm talking about how the groups I've worked with have eliminated epidemics of violence to zero for years at a time. And in the prisons of Massachusetts, the city of Boston, the jails of San Francisco. And then after we had done that, politicians abandoned those programs or dismantled them. And so what I'm writing about in my book now is not just the prevention of violence, but the prevention of violence, which is what we're dealing with. As a society, we have tended to be so oriented toward punishment as the only possible response to crime. And punishment stimulates violence. It doesn't stop it. I had people act as though if you threaten enough punishment, it'll stop people, it'll deter them from violence. I'd say it does the contrary. One of the worst examples of violence I ever heard about in the prison, and I almost collapsed. I thought I can't deal with this anymore. Was a guy who had raped a 14-year-old girl who was his next door neighbor. And then because he was afraid he'd be caught for doing that, he killed her and buried her in his basement. And I just thought I was going to throw up. I couldn't stand it. But what struck me was this notion that if you threaten people with punishment, that will decrease the amount of violence they commit. In this case, it increased it. I mean, if he had just committed the rape and got caught, well, yeah, there'd be a serious punishment. But then that motivated him to go on and commit something even worse than rape, and that is murder, because that's totally, there's no recovery from that. So punishment stimulates violence. It doesn't, and there are many other reasons I'd say this, but I think you hit every note that's important. I appreciate your input. Thank you.
Unfortunately, there was no debriefing after whatever I did. No one ever talked to me. No debrief. And last of all, it's remarkable the work you've done. Absolutely remarkable that you had the wherewithal to interview and speak with people all those years ago. That's very respectful of you. I really appreciate who you are.
Dr. Vrettos?
I just had 10 seconds. I attended a human rights event a couple of days ago at Riverside. Let me just remind everyone that we have a soon-to-be new mayor who's committed to closing Rikers and the 10 jails on the main island there. So political action is another way in which we can change the narrative and hold our politicians to what they say they want to do. So that's another way of expressing ourselves and not being cynical about this, because it's been said before, as you and Dr. Gilligan know, Bandy, but we have another chance here. So let's do it politically too.
Right. Thank you. Stephen.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Vrettos too. I'll believe that he closes Rikers when Rikers is closed.
I understand. I'm with you. Yeah.
Right.
But my question goes to Dr. Gilligan. I've been fascinated by this because I spent 20 years of my legal career advising judges on how to or when to or whether to impose the death penalty. Um, and to do that by crossing all the T's and dotting I's and sitting next to murderers uh, in courtrooms while the process played out. I am plagued by the notion of why any of it ever occurred. And so your framework for evaluating this shame versus guilt and these oppositional binaries, for lack of a better term, and shame and its opposite pride, and guilt and its opposite innocence, is, I guess, looked at through the prism of love and hate, which is another binary, as you or oppositional pairing. I have always been brought up and come to understand that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference.
Mm.
And that the reason why so much of this goes on
Yeah.
is because we as a society have become indifferent to doing anything about it. We love our death penalty down here in Florida. We really do. I mean, we use it as a cudgel. Politicians campaign on it. I'm a better ass than my opponent because I've done it, or I've prosecuted it, or I've sought it when it got reversed, or whatever. They do that. I'm curious as to what you think about the love versus hate, rather, or indifference thing, and how that plays into uh, your analysis of violence by the people you've seen in prison versus the violence that's visited upon them by the criminal justice system.
Well, thank you. Those are really good questions. I must say, if you spent 20 years doing this, you have my sympathy. I mean, that's a lot of time to deal with questions like this, which are very painful emotionally often. Um, I'd say, first of all, about indifference. Um, Actually, when you think about child abuse, the highest cause of death does not come from parents who beat their children, like the battered child syndrome. It doesn't come from sexual abuse or even just plain psychological abuse. It comes from indifference, from neglect. When parents neglect to take care of their children enough, the children die in so-called accidents. They'll fall out a window, or they'll run in front of cars or something, or they won't get fed properly, and so on. Now, one thing, when I talk about hate, and I understand your point that there's not just love and hate, there's indifference. But what I'd say is I think there are two forms of ways people can harm other people. One is active injury, which is what we usually use the term hate to describe. But the other is what could be called passive aggressiveness. And I'd say that's passive rather than active. Uh, but it is, and it certainly is more, it's more to do with the absence of love. And I think you're quite right. By the way, I don't mean to reduce everything to a binary. I'm really trying to go into I mean, I think of shame and guilt as thesis, antithesis. To me, the synthesis is love. And that's different from indifference as well as from injuring people and, being directly violent toward them. So I'm trying to say, let's get beyond the binary. And but you're absolutely right. Indifference is different, and yet it can be even more deadly. And I think with children, it actually has turned out to be more children are killed from neglect than are killed from being beaten to death. And about the death penalty, as I said earlier, punishment stimulates violence. It doesn't prevent it. The United States, I'm sure you're aware of this. The United States is the only developed country on earth that still has the death penalty. And we have the highest murder rate in the world, of the developed world. In other words, our homicide rate is 10 times as high as England's in most years, 5 times or 7 times as high as the European nations, the European Union, 5 times as high as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the other English-speaking democracies. None of them have really use the death penalty anymore, and their murder rates are a fraction of ours. In America, the states that have the highest amount of penalties, death penalty, I looked at comparing the blue states versus the red states. The blue states vote more for the more liberal politics and economics, and the red states for more conservative. The death penalty is there are like 20 red states. The death penalty rate, the number of executions in those states was 20 times as high. I mean, 2,000% as high as in the blue states, which most of whom do not have the death penalty anymore. And when I was in England, I met with the equivalent of their Supreme Court, the law lords, and they said, "How can you in America support this is just a weekend we spent to discuss these issues." They said, "How can you in America have the death penalty?" And said, "We're happy we got rid of it. We know if we had a referendum on the subject, the public would reinstitute the death penalty. So that's why we'll never have a referendum on this, because we're so thankful that we've got rid of it." So anyway, thank you for your comments. They're very relevant.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Vrettos?
Just very brief quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. "To be indifferent to evil is worse than the evil itself."
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Vivian?
Hi, Dr. Lee. Hi, everyone. And Dr. Lee, thank you for bringing us together with Dr. Gilligan and Dr. Vrettos. This has been a great conversation, and I apologize in advance if I'm all over the place. I have battled 4 mental health challenges, including ADD, and I have my notes are everywhere right now. But I just wanted to mention that I carry a lot of shame in needing help because I've been forced to live in poverty for 7 years, and there's a lot of shame in this country because you aren't, if you have a college, especially if you're college educated, you're supposed to work, get a job, get married, have children. And you aren't supposed to, I'm 55. I'm not supposed to be on general assistance in Minnesota and SNAP. I'm supposed to, be making a lot of money and be self-sufficient, but not in this country. And I spoke in front of like 90,000 people with the Poor People's Campaign 3 years ago, and it was like crickets on Facebook. Because most of the people I know do not live in poverty. They're successful. But at the same time, I know I've survived a lot and I'm successful in surviving a lot. I know I'm all over the place, but I just wanted to make that. And what I've learned from the Poor People's Campaign when I was involved, when you live from the bottom, everybody rises. And we don't understand that in this country because, of course, the media doesn't give the true numbers. Like there's 140 million plus forced to live in poverty in America. Who knows? Majority of people do not know that almost half of our nation is forced to live in poverty. And in the richest nation in the world, I wasn't a social activist until I became poor. I was never rich, but I've been forced to, and I decided to help try and make a difference. And I really appreciate, the mental health experts who've spoken out because it's all due to mentally unfit leaders and inhumane policies and laws. And it's just, if you think about it and you understand what's going on, it's a travesty. It's insane. It's immoral. But let me get to I don't want to take up too much time, but we need all hands on deck approach. I've been saying that for years to save our democracy, to save the soul of this nation, to save the world. It's asinine that, mental health experts, authoritarian experts, fascism experts, Reverend Barber and Poor People's Campaign, they're not all working together. And just like I don't understand why Reverend Barber. I mean, when I was in the Poor People's Campaign, I tried, I tried to drop it hints about the, mental health experts and with him and Reverend Liz and everything. I don't know why the pushback, because it's all related. It's mentally unfit people who are causing the harm in this world. And it should be a hands-on approach. I mean, it's just common sense. If everyone worked together, we could help contain, defeat, whatever word you want to say, these mentally unfit people really causing so much harm, violence, chaos, death, and destruction. And I guess I'll keep wrap it up. So, how do we get Democratic leaders to understand that? Because Dr. Gilligan, you and Bandy, I mean, you spoke to Democratic leaders. I mean, you've been warning for 10 years, and it's just crickets. And they won't even. I was involved in NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and they don't want to hear it, because of course the ties to the APA and all of that, but it's all tied together, the violence, the chaos, the destruction, the death. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. But either if Dr. Gilligan and or Dr. Vrettos want to comment.
I'd love to comment. I appreciate and so moved by your comments. I couldn't agree with you more. I can see in your background there, Cornell West. I'm in
the picture, Ashley.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And there's Reverend Barber. No, part of it is the progressive forces need to work together, and they are not doing it to the extent that they can do it. I have aligned myself for many years, actually, with Cornell West, and we protested stop and frisk. We were in the trial there, and as he points out, he's a prisoner of hope, and he realizes what you're realizing too, that so much of your feelings here and what you've said so in such a beautiful way are falling on deaf ears by both parties. And so that's why he's carrying on in the Justice for All party. I tend to believe more in that this will be the way to push those parties, the Democrats at least, our summit within the Democrat Party, toward what you're talking about. But again, it's an uphill battle, and just stay strong. And there are a lot of people out there, a lot of people, the great majority, who are with you, who understand what you're talking about. And we just have to, just be there to keep on keeping on, and straighten our backbone, as they would put it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
I think you're a great example in that, Dr. Vrettos. We're starting to run out of time, so I'll ask each question to be limited to 1 minute at most, and your comments also, responses to be limited to 1 minute. Thank you. Elaine.
Yes, hello. Happy holidays, everyone. My question is very simple. It's about how the perpetrator becomes invisible in situations where there's interventions for violence, and what are some improvements in interventions for allowing perpetrators to be addressed, as well as avoiding the survivors to be blamed by the entire system, and made, a lot of rhetoric stating that they are responsible, where at the same time they're saying, oh, it's not your fault. So if somebody could, anyone that wants to do it, but address that reversal of, the common phrase is it's everybody's fault but the perpetrator. If somebody could address that. Thank you very much.
Let me speak to that, because I've been dealing with that all my career in this field. People sometimes misunderstand what I'm doing. They say, you must care more about the perpetrators than you do about the victims, because you're trying to heal the perpetrators, not the victims. And what I would say is, I care more about the victims than you do, because what I'm concerned about is the greatest help you can give to victims is not to help them after they've been victimized, is to prevent them from being victimized in the first place. So what I'm trying to achieve is the primary prevention of violence and the prevention of trauma um, before it has occurred. And I figure we can only do that when we learn what's causing the perpetrators to behave as they do. That's why I started doing this, was to learn what causes. And then once we learn what causes, how can we prevent it? One of the main things, and this would also be partially an answer to the question you asked just before you came on, how can we achieve this? I can't overemphasize the importance of education. What I learned in the Massachusetts prisons, there was one program and one only that was 100% successful in preventing re-imprisonment and recidivism of violence. And that was over a 25-year period. And that was, I mean, we had zero recidivism for 25 years among one group, the group that got a college education while in prison. And then I thought, well, maybe we've overlooked some people. I looked at, I got the FBI to look. Had some of these people just moved to another state? No. And what I found is throughout the country, there's been one prison system after another that has found the same thing, that the most effective program is that. Now, I would say that's true also in our political system. The people who voted for Trump were much more often people whose education was high school or less, and often much less. The people who voted against Trump were those with college education or more. Again, these are statistics, and there are a lot of exceptions. There are many people who are self-educated, who are, better educated than many college graduates. So I don't mean to, idolize college graduates, but what I do say is education, whether it's self-education or education that we provide as a society. When I've given talks at community colleges throughout the country, and I've often got responses when I mention that idea that college education prevents recidivism. Students have said, why should you be giving a free college education to people who are in prison because of crimes they committed? I have to work 2 or 3 jobs to pay for going to college myself. Well, my answer to that is, you're absolutely right. Our system is insane. On the other hand, we're the richest country in the world, and we provide a free primary education for every citizen. We provide a free secondary education for everybody to high school. Why don't we provide a free tertiary education, that is free college for everybody? I think that one reason people on the right are interested in hobbling and paralyzing universities is because they bring about education, and they know that tends to make people more prone to policies that lead to less violence. So I'd say when I try to think, how can we improve things in this country? I think having free college education is one. It's an intellectually simple, answer, but I think it really would be one of the many things we need to do. But I'd emphasize that.
Excellent, Dr. Gilligan. Lori, 30 seconds, please.
I was born into a family where one parent treated me with respect, and the other parent carried emotional damage from her child and inflicted her neglect and violence on me. I believe that a lot of what we're talking about today stems from parenting styles. I have heard people say, and in the media, they discount, they say autocratic tendencies. Well, I think that's minimizing, like my mother, who, neglected me, beat me, past, all this crap that she did to me. Autocratic tendency? No, this was her inherited bundle from her parents that was passed to her. She died and never was able to acknowledge that she carried this with her, because I confronted her about this. I think that a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of good information here. But I think that we need to look at
the parenting styles in our country, because God does not reach down and say, this child is going to be mean and abusive, and this child is going to be good. This starts in the home. This is where, I see the stem of the violence and the good people. There's two different things. I was treated both. I chose to go and follow my father. He treated me with respect. I didn't want to replicate what my mother had done to me. So what are your thoughts on that?
Would either of you like to answer?
I could mention what you just described is very similar to what I described in my childhood, except that in my case, it was the father who was violent and the mother who was compassionate and nurturing and supporting and loving. Um, I was afraid my father was going to kill my older brother. He knocked him across the room so hard that if he hit the wall or a windowsill or something, he might fracture his skull and, wind up dead. Um, and I know that had a lot to do with what motivated me to finally want to learn what causes violence and how we can prevent it. Because as a child, I wanted to be a peacemaker, but I couldn't. I was a child. Um, and what I'm saying is, I think we need to realize that what you said is absolutely right. Violence begins at home. And in my first book I wrote on violence, I mentioned violence like charity begins at home. I mean, it's really child abuse. I'd never heard about as much child abuse as I did in the prisons. It actually was worse than what I experienced. The first prisoner I ever met with in prison was in there talking how his father had abused everybody in the family. And I thought it was just a sob story. He was trying to get me to feel sorry for him. Then I discovered his father was in prison at the same time. He'd been convicted of murdering his daughter, that is my patient's sister. So, his father actually had killed a sibling. Um, so those are all true. Um, I think we need to understand each other in that sense, help each other, empathize with each other, and try to do everything we can to create the social and economic and political and cultural and educational and all the other conditions that can help people to be less prone to violence and less vulnerable to using that as their default mechanism for solving whatever problems they're having.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
And stopping the patterns from continuing that you've both been able to do. I was one of the very, very fortunate ones, very blessed. My mother name was Lubov, which means love in Russian. So I was one of the lucky ones. I was never hit. I was never spanked. I was a pretty good kid. But we need to bring that to all homes as much as possible. And
Yes.
I agree with you all.
Thank you. Why don't we just get the remaining questions at once, if you can condense it to one sentence each, please. Ed?
Yeah, hi. Thank you all. A number of years ago, I was introduced to a concept, and I really believe this. I'd like to hear your opinion, that lying is a violence. And so if that's the case, like what do we think the motivations of, Fox News or Tucker Carlson?
Yes, thank you. Eric?
So I'm wondering, given where we are, what the model of change that Dr. Vrettos and Dr. Gilligan see as a possibility for moving us forward.
Thank you. Marcina?
Hi, thank you for wonderful talks. I'm interested in bureaucratic violence and especially in the legal setting. I'm a filmmaker and I'm working actively on this topic. And I'm wondering, in your practice, what prevents democratic institutions from assessing mental fitness in regard to people who hold coercive power? And the reason why I'm asking this is that I actually talk to a lot of psychiatrists, and uniformly, I get always the same response, that people who have deficiency in empathy, or they are empathy deficient, as they put it, should not be given power over others because they do not understand the concept of serving others. And I feel this amazing cognitive dissonance between the state of the field and all sophisticated studies and the state of the world. And I'm not talking only about the wars, but I'm talking about little wars. And actually it relates to Ed's question about lies, which are, or falsehoods, as I would say in legal settings, invisibility and all that. So my question directly to you is whether you've seen, you've encountered an initiative, you've given it a thought, or something. I'm looking for some pragmatic to this problem.
Excellent, thank you. Leilani.
Good day, everyone, and thank you, doctors. This is wonderful. My observation and then my question is that as much as we seek the words, it seems we're stuck in this paradox again, and I find it to be kind of a continuum. And my question is, when I'm the victim of a narcissistic father, and on his dying bed, I was able to meet with him the night before he died. He was comatose, but still, alive. And my brother and I sat with him all night. But I chose love instead of, in that moment, being the victim. I was just compelled to go inward and find that I really did have a heart that was bigger than I think many of us think that we have. And even though it was broken over the years of being, abused, at that moment, I chose love. And I said, Dad, I love you. And he said, a couple of days before that on the phone, he said, I love you too. And it absolutely shattered a part of me into a deeper place that I'm still in. And I've been transformed by this. And I'm just in awe of Dr. Lee and her capacity for being able to stay in the moment and keep eyes open to the horrific, and all you doctors. So I guess I'm asking, to me, maybe it's fear to love. I said to my husband last night, do we fear to love because we don't want to lose that love? Or the pain of losing the love is so strong that we become hypervigilant, we run and we, seek power struggles, and we get caught in these words and these paradoxes, as opposed to smile, reach out, love someone, all the musicians and the Beatles. And anyway, sorry, I'll go on and on. But anyway, I just, I'm thankful for you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Charlie, your last one sentence, please.
Yeah, okay. A book by Augustina Paglayan, published in November of last year, called Raised to Obey, where she goes into the origins of the public school system. And nobody has talked about this so far, is I believe that the public school system is one of the major sources of shame and, by implication, violence. And I really would like to, emphasize that this is something that should really be looked at.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. It certainly opens up a lot of topics that we can't all deal with, but that all the more reason to join us in our next course when we will launch our educational program through Preventing Violence Now, probably end of January. Well, Dr. Gilligan and Dr. Vrettos, would you like to give your last comments?
I could give some brief ones. I'll try to keep them brief. Let me put it that way. Yes, I agree that lying is violent. It amounts to when it's one individual to another, I'd call it psychological violence. When it's Fox News or a lying president, I would say it is it's political violence, but it's what is often called structural violence, that is trying to change the social and economic and political structure, the power structure of our society. And people who lie for that purpose. Yes, that's structural violence, but it's actually structural violence is actually more deadly than what we call criminal violence. Politicians are responsible for many more deaths than all the people we call criminals put together. Secondly, the possibility of change. I think that's what we're trying. Again, I would say I want to emphasize the importance of education. To go to the last question about public schools, yes, one psychoanalyst in St. Louis said that public schools are arenas of shame. I mean, that's often true. It's not always true, but it's often true. And I think I'm working now with an attempt to reduce the amount of shame in schools, public schools in Massachusetts. I've done it in San Francisco. I think that's very important, and I agree. I'm glad you brought it up. The question about why don't we diagnose politicians? Actually, that's something that Dr. Lee and I really did work on. Dr. Lee organized a symposium at the Yale Medical School, and I gave the main talk at it. And so there were three publishers present who wanted to publish what we had, and they finally did. And so we wrote a book, which became a New York Times bestseller for a few weeks, which was about diagnosing Donald Trump. But my my chapter in the book, which Dr. Lee edited, was the issue was dangerousness, not diagnosis. I mean, as the people can have a given diagnosis and not be dangerous. I mean, of all the murders in America, only about 1% are decided by the courts to be not guilty by reason of insanity. The other 99% are regarded diagnostically as criminally responsible. But on the other hand, they're dangerous. And I'd say the same. I mean, if you interview Donald Trump and did serious diagnostic testing on him, I don't have any question you'd find lots of different diagnoses, but that's not the issue. In some ways, it doesn't matter. What matters is how dangerous he is. And that you can learn. You don't have to interview him for that. All you have to do is pay attention to what he does publicly. I mean, we know more about him publicly than we may know about our own patients for quite a while. He's constantly making it clear how dangerous he is. So that's what I think I would start with. The question, can we do that? Can we institutionalize it? That's a more difficult problem, and I don't begin to have time to address that one.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for all your questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Gilligan. Dr. Vrettos.
Let me just say thank you so very, very much. The questions by all of you are just incredible, and I look forward to talking more with all of you. In our course coming up in the end of January. But let me just say this. So moved by so much of what you were saying. Leilana, you had the courage to put your words into action. And I think that's what we need to do. It is a matter of courage to stand up and to take a chance. And life is taking chances. And you were rewarded. And I think we need to have the words, we need to have the analysis, we need to be very directed in how we go about our studies and our research, but we also need the courage to stand up and not be afraid of the consequences. And because we have to live with ourselves ultimately. And I think that's the way that we need to speak or to think about this moment. And let me just say this, there's a lot of people throughout history that we can look at and read about and think about that have been involved in similar sorts of struggles. So we're not alone. I think Dr. Gilligan, at the beginning of our talk today, mentioned we are social animals. We need each other. We need to connect. And we need to connect with the sort of love, transformative love, radical love that is part of that human experience, and it needs to be structured and formalized and institutionalized in the sense in terms of policies. But it starts at home, yes, parenting, it starts in the schools, and it starts within our own individual soul. And looking into ourselves and not be afraid, because, right, the emperor has no clothes. I mean, really, a lot of these guys and who are in charge, they are clueless. And I don't know, we're sort of taken by their power. Forget about it. They don't know what they're doing. It's all, much of it is bluff, and it's bullying, and that's how you need to stand up in your own way, in a decent way, and not ranting and raving and violently, but in a way that really instills a sense of moral purpose and integrity that gives so many other people the courage to follow in there, because when you do that, a lot will be following in the effort.
Well, thank you very much for making this such a successful class, and please join me in appreciating our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
And you will receive
Thank you,
more
John.
announcements of the
Thank
upcoming
you.
classes.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
all.
Dr.
Thank you.
Keep the faith. All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.